Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, folks. Good morning, friends. I'm so sorry to have to change my plans today, but hey, we're just gonna roll with it, and it's not a big deal, and hopefully we can get back to normal stuff on Thursday and Friday. But apparently, me and my husband both being on the internet and me being on Zoom is just too much, and the first thing to go is Zoom, unfortunately. So we're gonna go ahead and do a lesson like this today. So, what we're going to talk about today, first is announcements. Yay! You're all so excited about that, I know. Announcements. First things first, you need to tell me what book you picked. Okay? There is a survey in the classroom under week 20. Tell me what book you picked. And the survey has all of the books listed, and all you got to do is click which one that you are planning on reading. If you and I agreed separately that you were okay to read a different book, there is a little spot marked other, and you are totally allowed to fill in the book that you and I agreed upon in the space that says other and go ahead and submit it like that. If you are sitting there thinking to yourself, what book? We're supposed to read things? Yes! You are supposed to pick a book off the independent book list. We talked about this last week. It is in week 19 in that classroom space, and it says independent reading list, spring 2021. There's a list of a whole bunch of books. You have to pick one off the list and get it yourself. I do not have copies of these. If for some reason you can't, I can provide you with an alternate book, but really you need to get this on your own. You can use the library, you can go to Brightside Bookshop, you can use Barnes & Noble, you can use Amazon, you can try Bookman's, but they probably won't have some of these. Some of these are really new, so I might try Brightside instead. If you're going to buy, I would buy somewhere local. But you have to pick a book, you have to get it, and you have to finish reading it before the end of February. So you've got about a month to get it and read it. I wouldn't put it off though. It's not really a good idea. Next thing, what I'm going to want you to do at the end of this class is to fill out a worksheet that's basically a KWL chart. This is what I know. This is what I have questions about right now, and this is what I want to learn more about. So, as we're talking, I want you to tell me what you already knew about this topic. I want you to tell me if you had any questions about the things that I said during the actual lecture, and then I want you to tell me something else that you would like to learn about this topic, or something that I said that you want to know more about, you want to learn about more in detail, okay? So, you do have stuff to do today. Me not being in Zoom class is not you getting off the hook, okay? So what are we talking about today? Well, we're going to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Yes. Except not actually today. Today, we are going to talk about why he was protesting, what he was protesting, and sort of the context of his moment. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was doing all of this stuff, protesting the civil rights movement, agitating for change. He was doing all of that in the 1950s and the 1960s. So that's far enough away for most of us that you need a little bit extra historical context in order to really understand what's going on. So, what we are actually going to talk about today is Black history in the United States. Just a little bit. And I'm going to keep my notes from the other classes out in front of me so that I don't get too far away from where I was supposed to be. Okay? Alright, so if we are going to address why MLK was upset, and why a lot of black people in this country were upset, and why they were agitating for change, and they were protesting, we have to go all the way back. All the way back. What year would you guess that we have to go back to? 1892. No. We have to go all the way back to the year 1619. 1619. And if you're wondering what the question for what you already know is, the topic of this is Black history in the United States and the Civil Rights Movement. So what do you already know about Black history in the United States or the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and the 1960s? And it's okay if all you know is, I have heard the name Martin Luther King Jr. Nice. We start in the year 1619 because this is the year the first African slaves are brought to the United States, or what will eventually become the United States. Okay? 1619. Ship arrives with some African people, and they are put into slavery. If you are not sure what slavery really is, that's okay. I feel like a lot of times people are just like, yes, slavery, without explaining it. If you are a slave, this means a couple of things in the United States during this time period. Slavery looks really different depending on who you are and when you are, okay? But slavery in the United States looked something like this. You were owned by somebody else. You were their property. Like a car. Isn't that awful? You had no rights and no freedoms unless your master chose to give you rights and freedoms. So if you were a slave, you were owned. You were property. And this is part of the big problem, is that in order to not feel bad about keeping other humans as property, people told themselves a lot of lies and made up a lot of excuses to make themselves feel better about it. So one of the lies that they told was that African or Black people were not fully human. They were more like animals or maybe children. So they had to take care of them. They couldn't be out there in the world by themselves. And if you don't actually view your slaves as human, it's a lot easier to take away human rights. Because you don't feel bad about not letting your dog vote. You don't feel bad about not letting your cows get married to one another. So if you see your slaves, people, as less than people, then you don't feel bad about the fact that you are keeping them from learning how to read and write. You are preventing them from voting. You are preventing them from getting married to one another. So part of this whole they are property, they are owned, is also dehumanizing them, making them seem less than human. And that's bad. That's so very bad. To treat other humans as though they are less than human is just awful. And that they had no rights and no freedoms. If you were a slave, you could not leave your master's property without permission. You could not own money of your own unless your master allowed you to earn and own money. You could not earn money unless your master allowed you to. So like, say somebody next door was like, I will pay you if you rake my leaves. Your master could say, no, they'll do it for free. You don't need to pay them. You were never paid regularly. You were given the worst food, the worst housing, the worst clothing, and you could be sold anywhere and treated any way that your master wanted. So if your master wanted to beat you, okay, your master got to beat you. Sometimes there weren't even punishments if you killed your slaves. Most people did not kill their slaves because slaves were worth more alive, but sometimes it happened. And usually masters were never punished for that. Oftentimes, too, masters would sell their slaves' children. So I want you to understand that being a slave was terrible. It was absolutely awful. And, you know, I would say like 98% of slaves were like, you know, the slavery thing really sucks. We really don't care for this that much. And there were lots of other people, too, who were like, you know, this slavery thing seems bad. Treating humans as less than humans seems bad. The United States was founded on the idea that all men were created equal and everybody deserves life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Except apparently slaves. How does that make sense? So there were people who were anti-slavery. The anti-slavery people are also called abolitionists. I don't know if you've ever heard that term before. Abolitionists. To abolish something means to get rid of it. Usually it's a legal thing, so you abolish a law and you get rid of the law. So abolitionists wanted to abolish slavery or to get rid of slavery. Now, most people who were anti-slavery lived in the northern half of the United States. This is important in a minute, I promise. And most of the states in the north had outlawed slavery after the country was actually created. Now, there's another group of people. If one of the groups is anti-slavery, then the other group must be pro-slavery. Well, they don't have to be pro-slavery, but they were. They saw slavery as a good thing, and they wanted to continue to enslave black people. And again, I would like to be very, very clear that while most white people did not own slaves, basically every slaveholder was white. There were a couple exceptions, but I would like you to understand that most slaveholders were white, and the vast, 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 vast majority of slaves were black. So, when we talk about slavery in the United States, it is tied up with being black, and it is very hard to separate those two things. Slavery is a black history issue. So people who were pro-slavery, they don't get a fancy name, but they were in the southern United States, the South, and right around the 1850s, the southern United States were like, you know, northern states, New York, Pennsylvania, I don't think we're ever going to agree about this, so why don't we just leave? We'll leave, and we'll start our own country, and we'll just have slavery down there by ourselves, okay? Sounds good. Unfortunately, they left, but it didn't stay all peaceful, and so pretty soon we have a fight between the northern anti-slavery part of the United States and the southern pro-slavery rebellious part of the United States called the Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America. This turns into, ta-da, so we have the North, the anti-slavery abolitionists versus the pro-slavery South, or the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. Now these two guys fight in the Civil War. And the Civil War was about 150 years ago. It was from 1860 to 1865. Most of you guys have probably heard 1860 to 1865. Most of you guys have probably heard of Abraham Lincoln. Most of you guys have probably heard of the Civil War. So hopefully this is not totally new information to you. Now, the North wins. Woo! When the North wins, they abolish slavery in all the United States. But they do more than just abolish slavery. All of a sudden, you have all these free black people. How do you try to help them be a regular part of the rest of the country? So, the North added a couple amendments onto our U.S. Constitution, okay? The main one that I care about today is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that you are not allowed to take away someone's right to vote or to do anything to stop them from voting or make it harder for them to vote. The fancy word is abridge. Ooh, what a fancy word, abridge. But you are not allowed to abridge anybody's right to vote based on race. Okay? Oh, that's the 15th Amendment. Sorry. The 14th Amendment makes them citizens. Sorry. 13th Amendment frees all the slaves. 14th Amendment makes them citizens. And essentially, if you are born or naturalized in the U.S., you're a citizen. Woo! Born in the U.S., citizen. Yeah. And you are not allowed to discriminate against this based on race, religion, anything like that. Is gender in there too? No, that's okay. Sorry, ladies. Except for Native Americans. Native Americans were not considered citizens of the U.S. till much, much later. Let's worry about that later. The 15th Amendment, that's the one we really care about. The 15th Amendment says that the right to vote shall not be abridged. So it shall not, be 2/3 of the right to vote. It won't even be 9/10 of the right to vote. It is the right to vote. It shall not be abridged. Fancy word. Based on race. This is the key word. Because it leaves some stuff out, doesn't it? It leaves out things like gender. It leaves out things like religion. It leaves out things like language. Stuff like that. Race, color, or previous condition of servitude, correct. But no gender, no religion, no nothing like that. It is only race, and it's only the right to vote. The United States Constitution freed slaves, made them citizens, and gave them the right to vote. But that was it. They basically didn't do anything else to help the slaves who had been freed. And there were still a lot of people in the United States who thought that that was wrong and that they never should have been freed from slavery. And those people were the people who were making the laws in a lot of ways, in a lot of places. So they started making laws to keep Black people from having certain rights or really being able to reap the benefits of living in the United States and having those awesome guarantees in our Constitution. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and everything that comes with it, like the ability to start your own business or the ability to say what you want. Not everywhere, but the ability to practice whatever religion you want. A lot of these things ended up being denied to Black people even though they weren't slaves anymore. So, they faced lots of other discrimination. Again, discrimination is kind of a big long word, and not everybody may be completely familiar with what it really truly means. I'm going to look it up in the actual dictionary so I don't screw it up. Discrimination. Shun. There we go. So discrimination is the act, practice, or instance of being prejudiced in your outlook, your action, or your treatment. So discrimination is prejudice or bias. And not just like having a prejudice or a bias, but acting on it. So, for example, an example of discrimination could be something like all teachers who have glasses are no longer allowed to teach. that is acting on a bias probably against people with glasses. It can go in a different way, though. It could say something like, only teachers who wear glasses are allowed to teach because glasses are the best. Even though that's positive for me as a glasses wearer, it's still discrimination against people who don't wear glasses. So even though it sounds good, it's still actually bad. Now, how black people were discriminated against is by things like segregation. Segregation was where they kept black people and white people separate, usually in public places. So, if you have a movie theater, there's a place for white people to sit and a place for black people to sit. If you have a water fountain, usually only white people got to use the water fountain if there was only one. If you had two water fountains, there would be a water fountain for white people and a water fountain for black people. Schools for white kids, schools for black kids, and they were separate, and they were separated specifically based on race. White people go here, everybody else goes here. And I do want to be clear that it wasn't just black people. People of Hispanic descent or heritage, Asian descent or heritage, Native American, basically anything that wasn't white was considered colored. We don't use that term anymore. But that's what I'm kind of trying to get across. You had, back in those days, you had whites only, coloreds only. And coloreds incorporated all of the different things except for white, essentially. The problem with this was, maybe if everything was perfectly, wonderfully, 100% equal, it wouldn't be a big deal. The problem is, and I'm sure you recognize this too, nothing is ever perfectly separate and perfectly equal. I'm sure you know this because have your parents ever tried to cut equal pieces of cake for you and your sibling? It's never really equal, is it? Somebody always gets this much more frosting. Somebody always gets a flower and somebody else doesn't. It's always just a little bit different. And in this time period, so this is the 1860s, 1870s to the 1960s, so 90 years of this, an entire old person worth of this treatment. So for an entire person's very long life, not only were black people kept separate from white people, but their facilities and things were clearly and obviously worse. I will maybe upload some pictures in a PowerPoint a little bit later so that you can see, but for example, if there was a white school and a black school, the white kids would have indoor plumbing, they would have really nice new books, they would have plenty of teachers, they would have sports and extracurriculars and fields where they could go play football. And then when you went to the black school, they would not have up-to-date books. They would have old ratty-tatty books. They wouldn't have indoor plumbing. They wouldn't have enough teachers. They wouldn't have a nice new football field. Many of the kids wouldn't even have the right clothes to go to school. A lot of kids couldn't even go to school in black families because they had to work on their farms and they had to help with the crops and stuff. And so they couldn't even go to school in the South. Even in the North, it still wasn't great. The North was supposed to be the anti-slavery one, right? Well, being anti-slavery doesn't mean that you are pro-black. So unfortunately, in the North, black people also faced a lot of discrimination. Another type of discrimination that they faced were what were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were laws that were specifically made for black people to keep black people in a worse position than white people. So saying things like black people weren't allowed to be outside after a certain time of day. Like if you were black, you were not allowed to be outside after 9 p.m. kind of a thing. Another one might be that in certain parts of the country, black people were not allowed to own a gun or a firearm of any kind. Immediately after the Civil War in the 1870s, if you were black, you weren't allowed to not have a job. And so what would happen is, if you didn't have a job, they would put you in jail. and they would make you work. So even if you didn't have a job, you were still working. And wait a second, you were working for free. Isn't that slavery? It certainly felt like it to a lot of people. Now, a bunch of different things happened, and we eventually get to the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, by the time we get to the 1950s and the 1960s, a lot of black people are kind of tired of this. Remember, this has been going on for 80 to 90 years. So most of these black people have lived with discrimination every day of their whole lives and every day of their parents' lives and their grandparents' lives and their grandparents' lives. And so by the 1950s and 60s, a lot of black people are starting to say, you know what, this isn't right, and we want to try to change this. So in the 1950s and 60s, we get what is called the Civil Rights Movement. Civil rights, ta-da! Civil rights are rights that people have to do things as citizens in this country. So the ability to start a business freely, the ability to vote freely, the ability to have the same rights as everybody else, to have the same benefits as everybody else, so to be able to use the same bathroom as everybody else, to be able to go to the same swimming pool as everybody else. So MLK, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was one of the leaders of this movement, and he organized things to fight against segregation and discrimination. So they did things to protest this, like they would host what were called sit-ins. These were actually not organized by Dr. King, but these were organized by a student college leadership committee. A bunch of college students were like, you know, this is a problem and we're going to do something about it. So what they would do is they would go to lunch counters and they would just sit there wanting to be served. Back in the day, in the 1950s and 60s, if you were a black person, you could not go into a lunch counter and ask for lunch. That's what they do. They give you lunch at the lunch counter. It's like a deli. You weren't allowed to do that. If you went in and you sat down and you asked for a cup of coffee, they wouldn't give it to you because you were black. So a lot of black college students would just go and sit. And what they were saying with their sitting was, we deserve to be served the same as white people do. And that's all they would do, is they would just sit. And you would be amazed at the amount of people who tried to hurt them, who tried to physically pull them off the stools, who stood there and yelled in their faces. Another thing that MLK was working for was integrating, that's the opposite of segregation, integration, integrating schools. The other thing that I really want you to understand is that this was not a long time ago. My mother was born in 1952 in Alaska before it was a state, you know. And my mother went to a school that integrated, that had previously been segregated, and went through the process of mixing black and white students. Black students in the area where she lived were brought in to come to her high school. And other students from her high school were taken to other schools to even it out and make it a little bit more mixed. Her younger brother was one of those kids who he went to what had previously been the black school, and a bunch of black kids came to my mother's high school, which had previously only been for white kids. So that was one of the other things MLK was fighting for. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was also fighting for voting rights for black people and other people of color. And do you know what else? People of different races were not allowed to get married until like 1964. That's the same year the Beatles came on Ed Sullivan. Okay? White people and black people couldn't get married in a lot of states. And so they were fighting for these really, really, really basic things. The right to get married to whoever you want to. The right to go to a whatever school is available right there. The right to go to the same school as the white kids. I'm going to give you a list of names in case you are interested in some other people to look up. And we'll talk more about this in our next lesson, but I would love for you to look up more about, if you feel like it, Rosa Parks. I bet you've heard of Rosa Parks. She's pretty cool. Look her up. She's real cool. I would also encourage you to read up more about Malcolm X. Malcolm X was also a leader of the civil rights movement, but his views were a lot different than Dr. King's. And I think it's worth looking him up. I would also encourage you to look up the Little Rock Nine. These were the first black students to graduate from a high school made for white kids in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they have a really cool story. If you're also looking for other people to look up about school discrimination and integration of schools, I would check out Ruby Bridges' story. Ruby Bridges was a kindergartner when she went to the white school. She had to have the National Guard escort her to school, and all the other kids, when she first started coming, all the other kids were pulled out of school by their parents because their parents were prejudiced and discriminated against Ruby Bridges, and they didn't want her to go to school with white kids. So they took all of their white kids out of the school. So for the first couple of months of school, it was just Ruby and her teacher. Things got better. Things got better. Ruby Bridges eventually was able to go to school with black and white kids. The Little Rock Nine graduated, and pretty soon lots of other black kids were going to white schools and all kinds of great stuff like that. I would also encourage you to look up, last one, Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife, Coretta Scott King. I hope I'm spelling her name right. She's pretty rad. We probably would not be celebrating Dr. King the same, except for his wife. After his death, his assassination, he was killed in the late 1960s. His wife was the one who actually created the King Center, who preserved his legacy, who continued to carry on his work after his untimely death, after his tragic, tragic death. And Coretta Scott King herself did lots of positive things for the black community. If you are interested, I also would look up the NAACP. This is an organization that is still around today, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and their job is to help out people who are facing discrimination. It is still mostly for people of color, but the NAACP does lots of work to help prevent discrimination in laws and stuff like that. So, what are you going to do now? I actually don't mean that in like a, what are you going to do about these problems kind of a thing. I honestly just mean, all right, we've learned a little bit about black history in the United States. What are you going to do now for your homework? Well, I would really like you to watch Dr. King's speech. Since you really don't have much other homework from me this week, you gotta make like 3 30-second videos. That's basically it. You have time to do this. It's less than 20 minutes long. So I want you to watch the I Have a Dream speech. I will post the link in the classroom. And I would like you to fill out that response form. What do you already know? What did you already know? What did I already talk about? Or what did you already know that I didn't talk about this time period? What did you already know? Then I want you to tell me if you had any questions about the things I talked about today. Like maybe there was something I said that didn't really make sense, or you didn't totally understand, or you don't totally get the reasons behind something. That's okay, that happens. Ask me those questions. You have to ask me at least one good question. And this isn't a question like, what's your favorite color? Or Why do you think this is important, Miss K? I want you to ask me a good, thoughtful question about something that we have talked about. How did Dr. King do this? Why were these laws created mostly in the South and not the North? Where were the biggest problem areas in the United States? Questions like that. Thoughtful, interesting questions, please. And then I would like you to tell me what topic you would like to know more about. What do you want to learn more about? Do you want to learn more about Coretta Scott King? Do you want to learn more about who Dr. King was as a person? He was a very normal person, an excellent public speaker and writer, but he was a person, and it's worthwhile to remember that. Do you want to learn more about Malcolm X? Do you want to learn more about the Civil War? Do you want to learn more about the Jim Crow laws? Do you want to learn more about segregation and integration? Give me something else that you would like to know more about, okay? If you have any questions, it will be easy to reach me through email. Unfortunately, it's just Zoom is being so rude. So rude. Oh, and I almost forgot. I have one last announcement. I am going to host a cooking Zoom this week. Well, technically a baking Zoom. Baking with Miss K. It's going to be at 1 p.m. this Friday over Zoom. I'm going to send out an ingredients list pretty soon and a Zoom invite for Friday at 1 p.m. But I'm really excited. I'm going to teach you how to make a very, very basic cake that you can play with. You can add all kinds of flavors and things to it, kind of like a base recipe for a cookie, but today we're going to do cake. You can do anything you want with it. Base layer of cake. And I will be doing that at 1 p.m. on Friday. You can come, you can not come, you can do whatever you want, but it would be lovely to have you because I'm kind of a disaster in the kitchen, and it's sort of super fun to watch me get flour everywhere. So you might as well come. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You are wonderful, wonderful humans, and I so appreciate you. Thank you. See you later.